Internet. It's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today we're talking about Strider, aka Aragorn. Now, as I mentioned in a previous video, of course, Amazon, their new Lord of the Rings series is going to be about young Aragorn. So I was doing a little research on Mr. Aragorn, and I found a really cool tidbit that I think would make for a great video. Hence, what we're going to talk about today. So, to do this, let's go back in time. Come back with me, if you will, to Tolkien writing his first drafts of Lord of the Rings. Now, from his letters and his notes and his son and unfinished tales, we get a good idea of how he crafted Lord of the Rings. And by the time, narratively, he had reached Moria, he kind of had crystallized the storyline. Sure, there were some changes as he went along, but for the most part, the characters, the actions from Moria forward were pretty focused. Which means, pre-Moria, so you're talking the Shire, Bree, Rivendell, those sections got many rewrites and drafts. Okay. Also, maybe not coincidentally, my favorite, section of Lord of the Rings is the Bridge at Khazad-dûm, the Moria section. So it's kind of interesting that that's also where he really first started hitting his stride, and was in a focused way on the Lord of the Rings tale. Okay, so obviously in this pre-Moria section, that's where we meet Strider for the first time. And that's when Frodo and his friends meet up with Strider in Bree per Gandalf's instructions. All right, so in the first drafts of Lord of the Rings, Frodo, for one thing, isn't Frodo. His name's Bingo for a while, but we'll just call him Frodo. Bingo. Okay, anyway, so Frodo goes to Bree, and he meets up with Trotter. So Trotter was the pre-stand-in for Strider. And Trotter is a ranger, but he's a hobbit. The reason he's called Trotter is because he wears wooden shoes. He's got clogs on, essentially, and he makes little clip-clop sounds when he walks. So he's, he's Trotter, the clip-cloppin' ranger hobbit. And he went through a few different identities. Tolkien at one point was even considering making Trotter Bilbo. But eventually Trotter turned into a relative of Frodo's who had, when they were kids, had left the Shire in search of adventure and had become a ranger. So you can see that's a huge difference, obviously, right? From what we have as Strider, Aragorn, rightful king, human, compared to our clog-wearing hobbit. So there's some really cool backstory though, and part of you might be saying like, well, so what? A lot of people go through rewrites. Authors rewrite stuff all the time. If he's not in the book, so be it. But what's interesting is there are residual passages and motivations from Trotter that still exist in Aragorn. And I'll show you those here in a second. But that's really what makes this fascinating, is there's some stuff that doesn't really feel Aragorn-like, but it's very Trotter-like. And so that's really where the excitement of this revelation comes. Okay, so very importantly, in his notes, and also in the writing, in the first drafts, Tolkien ascribed a particular backstory to Trotter, not just that he was a hobbit who had left the Shire, but Gandalf had sent Trotter to find Gollum. Much like we know in the actual storyline, Aragorn was sent to hunt down Gollum by Gandalf. Okay. But in this version, in the first version, Trotter followed Gollum into Moria. Okay? And so, because Strider never chased Gollum into Moria. He caught him well before Gollum ever got to Moria. But in this version, Gollum stayed ahead of Trotter. Trotter followed him into Moria and is captured and tortured by the Nazgul. So the Nine capture our hero Trotter and torture him in Moria until Gandalf comes and rescues him. And that all happens before this meeting at Bree. Okay? In fact, now here's the really ouch part, is one of his notes Tolkien writes is that he had intended at some point it would be revealed that Trotter doesn't wear wooden shoes. He has wooden feet, because essentially the Nazgul cut his feet off, torturing him in Moria. It's like, oh man, just the idea of that, and then the idea that his nickname comes from, people don't know because he keeps it secret. But so that people, when they call him Trotter, are actually reminding him of the torture that cut his feet off. Anyway, that's pretty dark for like a little, it's Bingo and Trotter, and they cut his feet off and replaced it with wooden feet. All right, anyway, so that was the very dark undertone to Trotter. If you remember from the story, from the finished version of Lord of the Rings, when the group, the Fellowship, is considering whether to go to Moria or not, right? Gandalf's kind of in favor of it, although he's a little scared, but he's been through it. He's been through Moria before, and he's come out alive. And so it's Aragorn weighs in at that point. And his line is, I too once passed the Dimril Gate. But though I also came out again, the memory is very evil. I do not wish to enter Moria a second time. So from that, you get the idea he entered from the Dimril Gate, which is the eastern gate. He didn't come from the west, the speak friend and enter side. He came from the other side and apparently left from that side as well. And he remembers the memory is very evil. That's all he says. Okay. Just to give you an example, this is the line from the first draft of that scene in which it's Trotter speaking, not Strider. And it says, "Yes, I know of the mines," said Trotter quietly. "I went there once, and the memory is evil." Okay, so we know the reason Trotter thinks the memory is evil is because he entered from the east, chasing after Gollum, and got tortured and his feet cut off, and he got rescued by Gandalf. And so that's his inspiration for saying the memory is evil. Now, Aragorn did not get tortured by the Nazgul in Moria. And so that's not, as far as we know, that's not what happened. Certainly didn't get his feet cut off. Certainly didn't follow Gollum there because he'd already caught Gollum. In fact, we do not know what that first trip to Moria was for Aragorn. It's now, obviously it's canon if you want to say, but it's built into the story. Many people, I think the conventional wisdom is perhaps that at an earlier time, he and some of the Dunedain did a recon mission to see if how many orcs were still in Moria, and they went in and perhaps were attacked, ambushed, and Aragorn lost maybe a ranger that's close to him, and they had to escape back the way they came. They couldn't go all the way through, so they were obviously stopped on the way. That's kind of the general idea, but we don't know that. In fact, I'm kind of hoping the Amazon series, I don't think that would be a first thing we see, but eventually we might see what happened to Aragorn and why he says the memory is very evil. Okay, but that's a remnant of Trotter, right? It sounds like that was in the storyline, and then Tolkien maybe just left it and ascribed it to Aragorn and say, well, he probably went to Moria too at some point. Okay? Now, but this is the passage that is certainly this residue, a leftover from Trotter, and it's from Bree. So when Frodo first meets up with, at the time it was Trotter and then later Strider, there's the bit where, and they show this in the movie, in the Fellowship of the Ring, there's that line where, they're in Bree and they know that the Nazgul are in town. And Aragorn says something to the effect of like, are you frightened? You're not frightened nearly enough, right? Something like that. That line is a reference to something that's actually in the story. But the way it's played in the movies is Aragorn he respects the Nazgul. He knows that they're very dangerous. But I don't get the idea that he himself is like, oh my God, there's Nazgul around. And, he's not terrified, right? And the book, I'm going to read the passage for you, but it definitely shows what I would consider to be a terrified Aragorn. And think about, we never really see, terror in Aragorn. I think this is definitely left over from Trotter, because Trotter would have had this horrible experience of, I was tortured by the Nazgul, and now I am terrified that they're in town. We don't know. I mean, Aragorn talks about having met up with the Nazgul before, but we do not know in what context that was. And we never do. But just again, listen to this passage. This is Aragorn telling the hobbits about the danger presented by the Nazgul. And you tell me if you don't see terror in this, if you listen to the lines carefully. All right. They are terrible. The hobbits looked at him, Aragorn, and saw with surprise that his face was drawn as if with pain, and his hands clenched the arms of his chair. The room was very quiet and still, and the light seemed to have grown dim. For a while, he sat with unseeing eyes, as if walking in distant memory, or listening to sounds in the night far away. There! He cried after a moment, drawing his hand across his brow. Perhaps I know more about these pursuers than you do. You fear them, but you do not fear them enough yet. Tomorrow you will have to escape if you can. Strider can take you by paths that are seldom trodden. Will you have him? So there you go. That's the passage. I like the fact that he uses trodden. It's kind of a reference back to Trotter perhaps as well. But so we see that his hands are clenched. He's pale. He draws his hand across his brow. He's scared in that moment. He is terrified. And it mentions the hobbits are looking at him with surprise, like, whoa, this guy is supposed to be like our, savior. He's our brick, and he's kind of melting in front of us here. And so I do feel like that passage was left in the story, and it was originally written for this character Trotter, who'd had this terrible, terrible experience in Moria at the hands of the Nazgul. I assume they were torturing him for information about the ring, right? I mean, if they knew that he was following after Gollum on Gandalf's behest, they probably thought, all right, this guy's plugged in. He knows stuff. Let's figure it out. So yes, that was Strider, Trotter. I think it also was interesting that, I'd always found it a little interesting that the Dunedain, the Rangers, included the Shire in the lands that they protected. It seems kind of inconsequential in the scheme of things, but the Rangers were basically looked out on the borders of the Shire. It would kind of make a little more sense if there were hobbits in the ranks of the Rangers, a la Trotter, who had left the Shire for adventure. He still cares about the place, and so would feel invested in guarding his homeland. So that also might be something that carried over from the original version of Strider, aka Trotter. So there you go. I thought that was really interesting. The fact that there is still this remnant of Trotter buried in Aragorn's character, and I'd love to see, what Amazon could do with the mythical trip that Aragorn took to Moria. Hopefully, it did not result in him being tortured by the Nazgul and having his feet cut off, unlike our poor Hobbit Trotter. Clippity cloppity. So there you go, everybody. Thanks so much. Subscribe if you want to get further updates. We're going to be talking about Counterpart and Discovery. I'll be back with some more Lord of the Rings topics in the future. So thank you so much. Bye, everybody.